Hello again. Nelson, Barbour, Taze, Russell, Three Worlds Plan of Redemption, page 176. They have reached the discussion of the seven churches, and most of what you'll hear here is still being carried on through the entire Russell period, right up into the finished mystery. Revelation 1, 13 and 20 is the opening text. And being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks, and in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man. He had in his right hand 7 stars. The mystery of the 7 stars, which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 golden candlesticks are the 7 churches. Revelation 1, verses 13 and 20. The 7 literal churches of Asia, whose names are mentioned in verse 11, were obscure, and judging by the writings of the apostles, did not compare with the churches of Jerusalem, Rome, Corinth, Galatia, Thessalonica, etc., etc., and yet they are used to represent all that the 7 spirits which are before the throne and the 7 golden candlesticks represented. Well, that's a dubious statement to begin with. The 7 literal churches of Asia. The first one is Ephesus, which is actually the most important church in the New Testament when you look at the influence it later had, the length of time Paul spent there, and the number of books in the New Testament that are directly related to the church in Ephesus. About half the New Testament, actually. He goes on, and we shall find the meaning of their names bear a close relation to the 7 stages through which the gospel church has passed, and that in this symbolic prophecy they were chosen merely as representatives of the gospel church. Seems more than probable because of this exceeding prominence given to them. If the 7 spirits of God and the 7 golden candlesticks are to be confined to the 7 literal churches of Asia, what did and do all the churches of other parts of the world amount to? Nothing, we may answer. The 7 golden candlesticks, which were before God in the temple, were the fountain or source of all the light of the holy place. That is also mistaken, by the way. There weren't 7 golden candlesticks. There were 7 branches of one. So Barbour and Russell obviously are misinformed on 2 levels already. As the gospel church is now the temple, the 7 literal churches of Asia have been a poor source of light to the Christian world. But the book of Revelation is a prophecy and not a literal epistle. Here they absolutely differ and diverge from the interpretation of the church of all ages, which is granted that the 7 literal churches of Asia are meant. Whether there's a secondary application is, of course, a question for conflict even within the commentators, but nevertheless the 7 churches of Asia, representing all churches of all time, is the majority position. But the book of Revelation is a prophecy and not a literal epistle. Well, it is a literal epistle. It's actually 7 literal epistles to 7 churches, and these 7 churches embrace the things thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter, according to verse 19. And therefore represent the whole gospel church, which has passed through 7 phases corresponding to the meaning of the names of these successive 7, and also in a certain sense by the particular character in which Christ, its head, is made to appear as each phase of the church is developed. That also is a distinct minority position over the history of the interpretation of Revelation, and certainly today very, very few commentators would support this idea. The 7 names which represent these 7 phases of the gospel church are, first, Ephesus, which means chief, desirable, and represents the first or apostolic phase of Christianity. The second, Smyrna, means a sweet odor and represents the church in the first persecution under the Roman emperors, before the corruption and falling away of which Paul speaks began. The third, Pergamos, means elevated and refers to the phase of the church at and after the conversion of Constantine, when the self-exaltation, corruption, and falling away began. The fourth, Thyatira, means sacrificed, and refers to that phase of the church when the woman fled into the wilderness where she was to be fed by God. The fifth, Sardis, means that which remains, and refers to the church just prior to the Great Reformation of the 16th century, at a time when true piety had almost been exterminated. The sixth, Philadelphia, means brotherly love and refers to the Reformation Church from the days of Luther to the beginning of the time of the end, or 1798. The seventh, Laodicea, means judgment and refers to the church of the time of the end, which includes the sounding of the seventh trumpet with its Advent proclamation, its time of trouble and day of wrath, its reward of prophets and saints and those that fear his name, small and great, and destruction of those who destroy the earth. The measurement of each of the seven phases of the church have been about as follows. The first reached to about the death of John, the last of the apostles. The second, from the beginning of the 2nd century to the conversion of Constantine in AD 312. The third, during the falling away and prior to the fleeing into the wilderness near the beginning of the 6th century. The fourth and fifth, from that to the Reformation. The exact line of demarcation not being so clearly drawn between these two, from the fact that the former represents the church in its sacrifice of life and property, and the latter the little remnant after its almost complete extermination, the change from the one to the other being a gradual work. The sixth, from the beginning of the 16th century, that is the Reformation, and to the beginning of the time of the end, which he's already said is 1798. The seventh, from the beginning of the 19th century to the setting up of the kingdom of God, or glorification of the church, which, if it embraces both those who go into the marriage and those who are to be ready when he shall return from the wedding, would appear to reach to the end of the sounding of the seventh trumpet. The little space left in these pages for this subject will not permit a full application of the history of the church during its 7 phases to the prophecy. We can only give a hint, as it were, for the guidance of the reader. So he goes into greater detail in this. We'll look at that in the next particular video. Will deal with how he breaks down these 7 periods in particular. What's the correct application of the 7 churches of Asia? Well, we had to struggle with that ourselves when we left the Watchtower, because of course they've already left behind all of this. Yet the thinking behind this application still remains. That is, that the church was somehow lost its purity very early, and it had to be restored at the beginning of the time of the end, which of course is now no longer 1798 but 1914 or 1919 in the case of when Christ gave the organization its mandate to be the only organization that represented him. All of that has its germ in this kind of interpretation of church history, even though they've abandoned the particulars. We'll put in a link, therefore, to our re-examination of the 7 churches, which made a big difference to the way Vivian and I viewed the church today. The first video in that series is called 8 Jolts for 2 Jehovah's Witnesses, all based in chapter 1, by the way. And next time, more about the 7 churches in the way that Barbour and Russell interpreted them.